Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. And in this particular video, I'm going to talk about AI, AI scaling, confederations for the AI, and just in general, the mid and late game of a campaign, which right now in Warhammer 3 does leave a lot to be desired. That's because the AI doesn't have any kind of scalability in the campaign. It starts with a certain number of benefits. Yes, there is faction potential, but simply not enough. So what I want to talk here is related to that particular issue to make longer campaigns more interesting. What I should point out, having played quite a bit of Pharaoh and Troy over the last couple of weeks and days, I can tell you that with respect to Troy, one of the things I really like is how a campaign can feel relevant and interesting throughout the entire experience, beyond all the issues that Troy does inherently have. And the reason behind that is because the AI is kind of able to keep up with you. But anyway, let's talk about Warhammer 3. And actually, we should talk about Warhammer 2. See, one of the things that would happen in Warhammer 2 in virtually every campaign was what you'd call the Order Tide. But really, it wasn't a question of the Order Tide. It was a question of various AI factions always confederating many other factions, smaller factions, legendary lord factions in their campaign. So Karl would get pretty much the entire empire, Tyrion would get Ulthuan, Malekith, for the most part, would get Nagorond, or the Dark Elves in general, and that's how you'd get the Order Tide, or various massive factions. But Creative Assembly decided to step away from that. For good reason. The Order Tide and those massive factions were not great. The reason they weren't great is you knew it was going to happen all the time. You knew which factions were going to confederate which, and you knew it was very predictable. So that is not a great system. What I feel Creative Assembly does need to do is ensure certain factions are confederating others, but randomizing. We already have faction potential in the game. So what I feel CA should do is, at the start of a campaign, pick one of the major factions. Like, for instance, dwarves can be Thorgrim, can be Belegar, can be Ungrim, because they're all close to each other, maybe even Malachi, or Thoric. But pick one of these factions, and same with the Empire, like Elspeth or Karl, for instance, and give them a significant confederation benefit. But not from the start of a campaign, but rather something that's going to build up, so that they start confederating faster and faster. And it doesn't even need to be a single faction within a particular race. It could be multiple factions dependent on the campaign area, because that would create dynamic and massive AI empires across the world. And it wouldn't be the same kind of empire every single time. It wouldn't always be Altdorf. It wouldn't always be Karazak. It wouldn't always be Hexuato, for instance, or Lothern. That kind of variety would be important. I mean, hell, it would be amazing if, like, all of Ulthuan basically united under Alif and Aro or Elfarion and decide to obliterate everyone in their path. We can talk about the climate problem that this would certainly raise in a campaign, and climate is certainly something that I hope Creative Assembly does decide to take a look at. Something else to mention here that would be really great with it is if Creative Assembly basically took a look at the Recruit Defeat the Legendary Lords mod and just made the baseline part of the game for yourself and AI factions, because dealing with legendary lords in a campaign is inherently more interesting than dealing with generic lords. That's just simply a fact. So just because, say for instance, Teclis gets wiped out almost all the time in every single campaign he plays, or the vast majority of times, that doesn't mean he should be removed. Like, he barely does anything in any High Elven campaign, or any campaign in general. So it'd be interesting to have that kind of experience where you would have these superpowers merging together to become a threat. Now, there are, of course, other things to talk about. AI scaling. And I've mentioned this in other videos, and what I think CA needs to do is they need to have a more linear difficulty curve. Because right now in a campaign, the difficulty curve is inverted. In the sense, the most difficult challenge of a campaign is the one you're going to face at the start. The reason behind this is that on every difficulty, minus easy, the AI gets a certain number of benefits. Upkeep, construction costs, recruitment costs, all that kind of stuff. Well, right now some things are ridiculous, like the recruitment slots that the AI gets are absolutely bananas, for instance, from the beginning. So some things should be more gradual, and these bonuses should keep extending. Maybe like, every turn the AI gets a 1% income benefit, for instance, upkeep benefit, combined with an upkeep benefit. or 0.5% upkeep benefit, depending on the difficulty you're playing on, right? Higher on legendary, lower on normal, or even reduced on easy. But this would be something that would make it so that the AI could try and keep up with the player. We could also talk about higher general recruitment, like the more you play a campaign, inherently the AI is just going to be able to recruit higher generals, and existing generals are just going to get free experience. Again, gradual, not instant. And I think what would be very, very important for this is if the process felt smooth. Not like, oh, I get to turn 20, the AI doubles its recruitment slots, for instance, and doubles its income. That would not feel great. But something more progressive. Now, how that would actually work, how difficult that would be to actually implement in the game, that is a different discussion altogether. And with respect to confederations, yeah, massive AI empires, but even more than that. Let's say, for instance, I'm playing, I know, a Grimgore campaign, right? And I beat the crap out of everyone over here. Well, once I do so, and I'm about to invade the Dwarven lands, assume Forgrim and Ungrim just defeated everything over here, and Forix coming from the south and Belgar and all that, they should all unite against you. One of the problems that happens in Total War, in the vast majority of cases, it's you can decide who you're going to fight and how you're going to fight them. If you're a good enough player, you can control the pace of a campaign. Now, we've talked a lot about AI aggression, but the problem with the way AI aggression has been implemented in the past, and what C8 toned down rightfully so, is that it felt bullshit. Like, it wasn't related to the actions you took on a campaign. It was just like, you're a big faction, or you're weak, and we're just going to march all against you. That was ridiculous. It should be in reaction to specific things that you're doing. So, say for instance, Grumgor is conquering the mountains more. Maybe the cast dwarves march against them, and then the dwarves march against them. That would just be an idea. Or the Empire is doing very well. Well, all of Chaos unites against them, for instance. More gradual. There are some things in Troy, and I will open up Troy in just a bit to talk about this a bit more. But this idea of actually having to deal with multiple factions and then various massive factions that are uniting against you, like let's say you're playing Archeon, you're destroying the world, then virtually all the Order factions should unite against you for good reason. But it shouldn't just happen all the time. It should be dependent on various actions. Like let's say you're playing an Archeon campaign, right? And you decide, okay, I'm going to go in Cafe. It wouldn't make sense for Karl France to declare war against you in that context. But similarly, if you're playing an Order faction, all of the Warriors of Chaos could unite against you. Demon factions, all and Norscan factions could unite against you. Just have those kind of dynamic fights, but not instantly, but more in reaction to what is actually going on the campaign map. And same for the AI, like AI versus AI conflict. It would make for a better and much more interesting experience in a campaign. So those are some of the things I hope Creative Assembly tackles. So Confederation for whoever rolls well with the dice rolling, but it shouldn't just be based on faction potential. It should be based on, like, the factions that get bonus to Confederation should be the factions that are doing really well for a particular race. So let's say, Forgrim does really poorly in a campaign, even if he has faction potential, he shouldn't get the bonus. If Ungrim's doing well, on the other hand, he should, regardless of whether or not he rolled well on the faction potential at the beginning of a campaign. Those are just some perspectives on this. Let me know what you guys feel about it, but let me move on to Troy and talk about certain elements of Troy that does very, very well in terms of creating a longer-term challenge on a more interesting long-term campaign than many other Total War games that we've had. You can talk about Realm Divide and Shogun 2. That was utter rubbish. It just screwed you over diplomatically with everyone. That is not a great system. So in the Total War Saga Troy, the game does a couple of things very, very well in respect of setting up for a long-term campaign that actually does feel interesting, because it does create two major power blocks aimed at one another. Now, of course, in Warhammer 3, you'd have several power blocks, maybe fighting multiple opponents at the same time, like one power block fighting two opponents, one fighting three, something along those lines, right? But you would have the idea of a series of alliances, both on your own side and the AI side, fighting against each other. I mean, we have the allegiance system. We do have various tools in Warhammer 3, but it kind of feels a solo game. Even when you're fighting multiple factions and you have allies, a lot of the times your allies don't feel like they're doing much. We can talk about, like, again, AI scalability in a campaign. But here's how Troy does it. The major Achaean factions and the major Trojan factions, all of them have really good relations with with one another. It's not universal, but if you're playing Menelaus, which I have in this campaign, you have Agamemnon, Odysseus, Ajax, Diomedes, and Achilles that are all, and you're all gonna ally together. And on the Trojan side, you have Aeneas, Hector, Paris, Lycia, who again are gonna ally each other, and they can confederate each other as well. So these are major power blocks. The benefit in this is, unlike, say, Warhammer 3, where you can pick your fights, if you defeat one or two major enemy armies, you know you've more or less defeated a faction unless they have a lot of armies or a lot of territory. But here, it's not enough, because other factions are going to come in and they might attack your undefended territory. For instance, in this particular case, Hippolyta just snuck in an army all the way close to Troezen and Salamis, and, well, there is a Troezen army here that could potentially stop her, but you can't necessarily rely on that. This changes the dynamic of the campaign in such a significant way and in such a great way. These two series of alliances duking it out against each other, and this happens early in a campaign. It doesn't happen like turn 30 or something. The alliances are formed very early. You start with good relations with one another. You can go and do your own thing. You can be very selfish if you want to, but you're encouraged to do so. Like, you can, like, say for instance you're playing a campaign as the Achaeans, you could spend the entire campaign in Greece if you really want to. I mean, eventually you will have to go and deal with Troy, but only Troy, not all of Anatolia, or Western Anatolia that you do have in the game. So that is a really great decision on their part with respect to it. But there's more to it than just that. See, another thing that this game does so brilliantly is the idea of an antagonist. So what the game does is that it picks a faction, one of the strongest factions that's on the opponent's side. In this case, it's Rhesus, because he's the only one that hasn't lost significant armies trying to stop us. Like, what's interesting here is, like, I've been fighting in the southern portion of the map, whereas Achilles, Diomedes, and Ajax, and Diomedes has confederated Menelaus, they've been fighting over here in this northern part. I mean, we've been fighting together as well, sure, but like, I'm doing my own thing, contributing or dealing with Lycia and other factions over here in the south, Amazons as well, marching under Heartland. But a lot of fighting is taking place over here, with a lot of armies being recruited by both of the major AI power blocks, and they're really duking out. Now, don't get me wrong, Troy has a large number of issues in terms of its design, but this idea is so great, and then having to deal with an antagonist faction which you can't engage with diplomatically, because if I look over here, if I do find Thrace at some point, I cannot engage in diplomacy. So it's basically creating a large-scale war from the very beginning of the campaign. It's called Troy, obviously the Trojan War. But on top of that, it's also creating a dynamic experience between these two major power blocks, as opposed to just one faction versus another, with the added cherry on top of having a major faction as your ultimate opponent, if you will, in a campaign. Like, one of your victory conditions, the total war victory, is to defeat your first antagonist faction, so your major opponent. So I would have to deal with Rhesus in this case. And that is a wonderful system for a campaign. Makes things so much more interesting. Like, I've been playing this campaign for 78 turns, and let me tell you this, I was not bored. In fact, the only portion of it I was actually bored was early on, when things are not particularly great for Menelaus. Troy has issues. But, like, once I got the ball rolling, well, things are a lot more interesting. I have to deal with a lot of territory. Well, not necessarily a lot, because I don't necessarily have a huge number of provinces. It always feels like in Warhammer 3, you do need to control a large empire to maintain a lot of armies. Here, I'm not really controlling that much compared to, you know, what I would control. What I would control. I only own 7 provinces in 78 turns, but damn, there's been a huge amount of fighting over here during the course of this campaign. It won't let up. Raiding, counter-raiding, agents working against each other, armies, you know, trying to maneuver against each other, me setting up ambushes, the AI trying to get the benefit against me. All these kind of things have been happening throughout this entire campaign. And if there's anything Creative Assembly should replicate from Troy, it is that feeling of playing a long campaign where you do have a goal, where you do have an opponent that's able to stand up to you. That would be the critical point that I'm trying to make here. That's all I had to say. Questine signing out. Let me know what you guys think, what ideas you guys would have on this particular subject, and stay tuned for more.